All right. Welcome everyone to this month's version of the Roman Community Forum. Thanks so much for calling in today. Today we're going to be hearing from three different people. We'll be hearing first from Jeff Kruk, who will be giving us updates on from the Roman project. Then we'll be hearing from Dmitry Savransky at Cornell, who will be giving us updates on the Roman CPP, the Chronograph Community Participation Program. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Ilya at JPL, who will be giving us updates on the chronograph itself. So talking about all the testing during TVAC and full functional testing and its recent delivery to Goddard just a few months ago. And then we'll all be looking forward as Roman starts to integrate, because Roman just passed its systems integration review a few days ago. So without further ado, Jeff, please take it away.
All right, thanks, Rob. For those who don't know me, I'm Jeff Kruk. I'm the Deputy Senior Project Scientist for Roman. And let me go give you some updates. It's been 2 months, I think, since we had a sort of project status, and actually a surprising amount has happened in just those 2 months. So maybe just starting off with what maybe the big one is the wide field instrument was delivered. And I should explain perhaps that delivery doesn't just mean that they put it on a truck and it showed up. It means that every requirement that was levied on that instrument has been verified by test or analysis, and that every one of those requirements has been reviewed. There aren't any outstanding liens. So it means like it's supposed to show up and be ready to go. The instrument carrier, we've been showing its progress over the last several months. It has finished environmental testing, and I think as of today, it counts as delivered. There might be some rearrangement of a few of the harnesses on there, but it's essentially also now ready for integration at a higher level. The telescope is not yet delivered, but it is complete. It has undergone all of its structural and dynamics testing, excuse me, and is in the middle of thermal vacuum testing. So that's supposed to complete in the next several weeks, probably 2-ish weeks, maybe 3. And it's due to arrive at Goddard at the end of sometime late in October. We've been showing some photos along the way the last several months of the outer barrel assembly, the solar array sun shield, and the deployable aperture cover. Those are essentially all also count as delivered. We've completed the structural testing of the outer barrel assembly. Its thermal sensors, heaters, and blankets are being installed as we speak. And those 3 elements get integrated over the course of the fall. And then once integrated, then they go through, they've all been tested individually, but then they get all the structural and thermal tests as an assembly through the first part of next year. The spacecraft, one of the pieces that had been remaining came with the wide field instrument. The instrument computer and mechanism control electronics have just been integrated into the spacecraft, and it's undergoing final electrical integration tests, again, just as we speak. So at this point, the spacecraft bus, excuse me, is complete, except for the telescope control electronics, which get delivered along with the telescope in about a month. As Rob said, we just completed the systems integration review. This was the major milestone in the transition from what NASA calls Phase C to Phase D. This basically marks the delivery of all the separate observatory components. The one thing that is hanging out from that review is the telescope, of course, because it hasn't been delivered yet. But most of all the tests and analysis of the telescope completed to date were part of that review. and the remaining test results get delivered to the board as we have them. So the sort of remaining parts of that process, every one of these things is never just a single event, but it's a process. So all the results from the review and the assessment of the review board, which is not just technical status to date, but it also includes their review of our plans for everything between now and launch and in-orbit checkout. So they present all of those findings to Goddard Center Management in November, then again to the Science Mission Directorate at headquarters in December, and then finally the Agency Program Management Council in January, and that's when they sort of bless our budget for the remaining activities. Let me go ahead and show you the project schedule. This is all the remaining steps between now and launch. We are still on track for launch in October of 2026. That launch date hasn't changed since the post-COVID replan, and we still essentially have 3 months of funded schedule margin between now and that launch date. So that's in excess actually of what NASA requires that we hold. So all of that is proceeding quite well. I'm just going to show you some pictures here. The upper left is the instrument carrier just before it went into its thermal vacuum testing, and that includes the what we call the mounts that go between it and the spacecraft. They're called the launch loads and vibration isolation system. They support the entire payload through launch. And then after that, they serve to isolate vibrations from the spacecraft bus from getting into the optics assembly. At the sort of bottom center of the picture is the instrument carrier on the centrifuge when it was undergoing strength testing. That happened a couple of months back now. Over on the right is the telescope along with some test equipment in one of the thermal vacuum chambers up at L3 Harris. You can't quite see it, but just above the sort of platform at the top of the picture is a big autocollimating, full-size autocollimating flat that's used for the optical testing. But if you look closely, you can see the way they actually do this is they hang the telescope from the upper support frame so that vibration from the anything going on in the ground, trucks going by, whatever, doesn't disturb the or introduce jitter into the alignment between the telescope and the optical test equipment. And then finally, top center is a picture of the completed coronagraph, but without the sort of thermal blankets and contamination covers that would be present. Then moving from the payload to the spacecraft bus and the other elements, there's a picture from below the spacecraft bus on the left, showing the deployed high gain antenna. If you blow it up and look closely underneath there, you can see the RF comm panel. The red boxes there are protective covers for the various propulsion system thrusters. In the center is the outer barrel assembly that sort of goes over the payload. Bottom center is the engineering unit solar arrays. We have the flight ones, but they're not yet mounted into something that looks like the solar array sun shield. And then finally on the right is the what we call the deployed aperture cover. Of course, these pictures don't do it justice for scale. That's pretty much 3 meters across and more than 3 meters tall, so it's quite large if you're standing next to it. Here we just have a picture on the left of the high bay with the spacecraft bus on the test structure used for high gain antenna deployment tests. In the center is wide field instrument with protective covers on the radiators. The actual radiators are a very high emissivity black, but those coatings are very fragile. So except when we're doing thermal testing, they are kept covered. In the right of that picture is the coronagraph under a sort of contamination tent, but it's also there at this point being used for or undergoing some electrical tests. And then finally on the right is the spacecraft bus with the lower instrument sun shields deployed. I've repeated a slide from last time with 3 conferences. I've repeated it because now all of the talks, presentation files and recordings are now available through the websites there. The other thing that's happened about a month ago now is the community survey definition committees had basically public town halls for each of those surveys spread over 2 weeks. And again, the link there can take you to files with the presentations and recordings. Some upcoming workshops. There's a half-day workshop at IPAC, and also remote access on October 11th for if you're interested in Raman spectroscopic calibrations. This is with the wide field for prism and grism observations. There is the next in the series of planning workshops for use of the 100 nights of Subaru time is planned for December in Japan, and the website for that is there. There's an interesting flux calibration workshop at the Institute coming up in about a month. Unfortunately, registration for that closed about a week ago, but I've got it up here for reference. We're going to have a big presence at the AAS meeting this winter. The program hasn't all yet been published on the AAS website, but there are several special sessions, winter sessions, and of course a town hall. But of particular interest for those who plan to use the wide field instrument, there's going to be a all-day workshop on how to use the science platform for accessing and analyzing Raman data. So it's, yes, it's still 2 years till launch, but just as with Rubin, it's going to be a different way of accessing data than most of us are used to, and it'll be, I think, really worthwhile to start getting familiar with how that's going to work. We're basically staying on a pretty aggressive schedule for defining the core community surveys. Here again, I've got some links to where you can reach the presentations that the survey definition committees gave a few weeks back. They are due to provide basically 3 different options for the survey definitions at the beginning of November, with their full reports due mid-November. Those then all go to the Raman Time Allocation Committee, and they are due to come back with recommendations to us next February. That rather aggressive schedule is needed for a couple of reasons. One, to give us time to ingest all that and to actually define the nitty-gritty details in the planning and scheduling system. But more importantly for users, it lets everyone know what kind of survey data are ultimately going to appear in the archive. And that then is the basis people can be using to write archival guest investigator proposals. Also, what's been ongoing over the course of the year is first we had a community panel consider the possibility of an early definition general astrophysics survey. Their recommendation was to do one for observations of the galactic plane. So we're approaching that the same way as for the core community surveys. There is was a panel convened to define what this survey looks like. They have had their kickoff meeting just a couple of weeks ago. The website there has the membership of that committee, and that's where results from their deliberations are going to go over the coming months. And finally, I just want to give a shout out for the upcoming Roses Call. This is the second one that's going to occur, second and final one that's going to occur pre-launch. The draft text has been on the Roses website now for several months. The comment period ends in a few days. The basic structure is the same as the prior one. There's calls for grants for studying wide field science and for joining the community participation program for the Coronagraph. The final schedule for this solicitation hasn't yet been posted on the Roses website, but the final solicitation is going to be released this fall, and the proposal deadline will be early spring. And that is it for me. I'm happy to take questions.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. We have time for one or two quick questions. You can do it one or two ways. You can raise your hand by clicking the little high five hand icon at the bottom of your screen, just like this, and I'll call on you to unmute yourself, or you can write your question into the chat. So I'll pause here and wait a second to see if anyone has any questions. Right, it seems like we have one. Casey's asking, are there opportunities for those of us not at WS to learn more about the science platform?
Yes, absolutely. I don't have a link handy, and maybe it hasn't even been made public yet, but there are going to be a series of hack sessions for the platform. We've actually had one with already, but there will be several more over the coming months, and those will be publicized, and they will be both in person and virtual. And I'm not quite sure yet what the cadence of that is supposed to be, but we will be definitely ramping that up once we're past the AAS.
And we'll make sure to advertise that on all the normal mailing lists as well. So you'll hear
Right.
about it one way or the other.
And I should add, as we get a little bit farther, and we've got the initial set of bugs out, we will also be making some of the thermal vacuum test data available. Well, some of it will just be directly on MAST. There's already some earlier data there, but it will also be available through the platform for people to work with.
All right, not seeing any other hands, not seeing any other questions in the chat, but as always, we'll have updates from project folks, whether this is Jeff or Julie. So make sure you call in next week or next month as well. And otherwise, we have to release Jeff to his other triple book meeting. So thanks again, Jeff, for calling in and for getting those updates. Really appreciate it.
All right,
Jeff
thank
a round of
you.
applause. Giving some clapping hands emojis. Next up, we're going to go to Dmitry Savransky. Dmitry, do you want to start screen sharing, please?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So Dmitry will be giving us updates on the CPP program, and Dmitry is one of the co-leads of the CPP and is a professor at Cornell. So Dmitry, thank you again for giving today's talk, and take it away.
Great, thanks very much. Hopefully y'all can see my slides properly. So yes, I'm presenting on behalf of the Roman Coronagraph Participation Program. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the instrument and what the CPP is and what we're working on. And so apologies if this is redundant with things that you've already seen before. I'll try to go quickly over the background material. Right, so I think that everybody in this forum knows that Roman will carry a second instrument in addition to the wide field instrument. This is the Coronagraph instrument. And just the very important things to keep in mind about the Coronagraph instrument is that this is literally the very first time that we will be able to do active wavefront control in space with a coronagraph specifically designed for the purpose of imaging exoplanets. This will be our first opportunity to actually get visible light images of potentially known exoplanets, which is incredibly exciting. As a technology demonstration, we have one single threshold requirement. We are required to show a 10 to the negative 7 level of contrast. And as you will see from Ilya's talk coming up next, we are fairly confident that that is going to be readily achievable early on in the mission based on the instrumental performance during thermal vacuum testing. However, the instrument was designed to actually perform significantly better than that threshold requirement. And so as soon as we achieve what we need to demonstrate for mission success, then our strong goal is going to be to push the limit to push the limits of instrumental performance so that we can learn new things. And in particular, what we are trying to learn is everything we need to know about doing space-based coronagraphy with active wavefront control as a stepping stone on the way towards something like the Habitable Worlds Observatory. And we get to do all this in 450 hours of commissioning time, followed by approximately 90 days of observing time spread through the first 18 months of the mission. I'm positive that almost everybody has seen some version of this figure, but as a reminder, we think about coronagraphic performance in a phase space of flux ratio or magnitude difference between host star and planet, so a measure of how bright the planet or bound object or background object is to the host star that we're blocking with the coronagraph. And on the other axis, we have the projected separation on sky of the planet. And so current performance on the ground, which is really limited to the near infrared, because that's what we observe from the ground, is just getting to the kind of 10 to the negative 6 level, 1,000,000 to 1 levels of contrast. The various masks that are on various spacecraft such as Hubble and James Webb were not originally designed for this type of imaging, so they really have much poorer performance than anything that you would need if you were going after actual planets such as the ones in our solar system. And our ultimate goal is to end up here. NASA's stated goal is to eventually be able to directly image planets such as the Earth, which requires a contrast factor of 10 billion to 1 at projected separations of 1/10 of an arcsecond or so. And so going all the way from current performance to this level of performance is an incredible technological leap in many different dimensions. The Roman coronagraph instrument will serve as a stepping stone because, as I said, even though our requirement is here at 10 to the negative 7, we expect to be able to push the instrumental performance to a few times 10 to the negative 9. And along the way, we will learn a lot of stuff. And again, this is a technology demonstrator, but the single best way to demonstrate a technology is to actually use the technology for its intended purpose. And the intended purpose of the instrument is to do science. So we will be carrying out science-like observations on known self-luminous planets that were discovered from the ground-based observing in the near-infrared. We will be trying to image them for the first time in visible light wavelengths. We will be looking for planets previously discovered via Doppler spectroscopy, the radial velocity method. And so we know that the planets are there, but we really have no idea about how bright they are or even really how large they are. This is providing us with the first ever possibility of actually getting visible light images of a true Jupiter analog. So finding a planet like our own Jupiter in another solar system. We will be studying disks. Every time you do direct imaging anywhere, you instantly see disks and dust, and we will be getting the most precise measurements of that ever. And that's incredibly important because the quantities of exozodiacal dust and the brightnesses and morphologies of exozodiacal dust are one of the large unknowns and one of the large risks to something like the Habitable Worlds Observatory that is going to be trying to go for Earth-like planets. And then we will, of course, be doing any other technology demonstration observations that teach us something that is valuable to HWO and other future direct imaging missions, and really any clever thing that anybody in the community can figure out. So The CPP was formed out of this 2022 NASA ROSES call for the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope Research and Support Participation Opportunities. This call solicited proposals in 3 different categories, one of which was the Coronagraph Participation Program. And the CPP category specifically was limited to either sole PI or small group proposals, but always had the intent of cobbling these individual investigators into a single cohesive CPP team that would be composed of the selected US teams, representatives for international partners, representatives from the Coronagraph science and engineering teams, and members of the Roman Science Support Center at IPAC. And so this was solicited in 2022. The awards were made and the CPP was stood up almost exactly a year ago. And the intent is for this to last through launch and be augmented with additional potentially additions to the team that will be solicited in the next ROSES call that Jeff just mentioned. So the top priorities of the CPP are exactly the priorities laid out in the original ROSES call. They are to make the Roman Coronagraph instrument as productive as possible. And so what that translates to in terms of current tasks are we are responsible for the development of the Coronagraph instrument data reduction pipeline. We are responsible for the development of the final target and reference star database. We, in service of that, are carrying out a series of vetting, observing programs for those reference stars, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We are responsible for finalizing instrumental calibrations and the development of observation, scheduling, and analysis tools, and finally, simulating everything so that when we do get the data back, we will actually be in a place where we can interpret it and understand it properly. And when we've done all of this, then we can also start thinking more deeply about preparing for beyond requirements observations. And those are all the things that push the limits of instrumental performance and teach us about doing coronagraphy in space. So the CPP is structured around a core team that is composed of the selected 7 US teams. From the ROSES call, we have 4 international partner PIs and Roman Project ex officio members. So that's what we call the core team. The larger teams around those people are known as the project team. And then we also have a larger community team of just interested folks from the community, and absolutely anybody is free to join that. And anyone who wishes to contribute or just listen in is welcome on the CPP community team. We have stood up 4 working groups. These are the observations working group, which is responsible for observation planning and that target and reference star database, the data reduction and simulation working group, and finally a hardware working group. And I'll say a little bit more about what each of those groups is working on. And then this past summer, in collaboration with our JAXA partners, we've also created a new polarimetry working group to do all the things that I described, but specifically in the context of the instrument's polarimetric capabilities. We also have a climate committee that is in charge of carrying out, maintaining the climate of the community, but also doing various things like early career researcher mentorship programs and outreach programs. These are the people on that core team. We are led by Vanessa Bailey, who is the Roman Coronagraph instrument technologist and the CPP chair. We've set up the CPP to have rotating co-chairs every year. So I was lucky enough to be the inaugural co-chair this past year, and I will be rotating off shortly, and another team member will serve as the co-chair for the second year. And here are all of the US PIs and international partner PIs. And then these are the people on the project team. These are the folks doing the actual hard work. So very quickly, what are the various working groups working on? I'll start with observations working group. As many of you may know, the primary science-like observations that the coronagraph will carry out will actually observe 2 stars at a time. We will be both observing the target star, the star that we believe hosts a planet that we may be sensitive to, and a reference star, which is a brighter star that has no known planetary companions. And the reason for observing the reference star is twofold. First of all, the reference star, as I said, will be brighter, and so it will allow us to create the region of high contrast via the iterative procedure used by the coronagraph to create its high contrast region faster than if we were using the actual target star, which in many cases will be dimmer. And so we're just going to leverage the brightness, the higher photon arrival rate to speed up the iterations to dig the dark hole. At the same time, the reference star will serve as a reference PSF for post-processing. So it serves both those purposes. This imposes some very strict requirements on what the reference stars must be. The reference stars must be single stars. We can't have multiple stars or things with bright background sources or companions. They must be bright, so we're looking for V-band magnitudes of better than 3. They must be as unresolved as possible, and so right now the requirement that we're carrying is an angular diameter of less than 2 milliarcseconds because the coronagraph really doesn't like looking at more extended sources, if you can call 2 milliarcseconds extended. And they have to be, at the time of observation, in favorable geometries with respect to the actual target star, such that we minimize the change in the observatory pitch angle when slewing between reference and target. If you put all of these things together, essentially you end up with a fairly small number on the order of 60 candidate reference stars spread throughout the sky. And this also drives you to primarily selecting giant B stars, because that combination of small angular diameter and very bright kind of pushes you to these B stars. And unfortunately, B stars have an incredibly high binarity fraction. So we expect that many of these that were first gotten from literature searches will end up being binaries. So it's incredibly important to pre-vet these. And so a key aspect of the work of the observation working groups for this first year has been putting in proposals, many of which have been successful, for ground-based observing programs that will go and observe these potential reference stars and provide us with more information, and also most likely, unfortunately, remove some of these reference stars as potential references because they will end up being binaries or multiples. This is described in great detail in Skylar Wolf's SPIE paper from this past summer. Skylar is also the lead of the observations working group. The data reduction and simulations working group has been working primarily on the data reduction pipeline. We, as I said, are responsible for delivering the data reduction pipeline, which will be run at the Science Support Center that will produce the level 2 products. This is being developed as entirely an open source project on GitHub. You can go to this website at any time and see the progress. We just had our first major milestone, which is a preliminary release, which ported a lot of the engineering pipeline developed at JPL into the final version of the pipeline, which will be called the Corgi DRP. And there's another release scheduled for the end of this year. And there's a lot of detail on what is happening with that and the simulation work in Max Miller-Blanchard's SPIE paper, and of course also in the GitHub page. So I urge anybody who's interested in DRP to take a look there. Another key aspect of this work is setting up our target and reference star database. We actually aren't starting from scratch. We've decided to basically transform an existing database, originally built by my group, known as the Imaging Mission Database, into the final Roman target database by greatly expanding it and improving a lot of its capabilities. What this database does is essentially take every known exoplanet host as listed by the NASA Exoplanet Archive, select the best orbital fits from the ones that exist in the archive, calculate a bunch of additional properties that are relevant to direct imaging, couple of these with photometric model grids, and then do a bunch of kind of arcane processing and coupling this with an exposure time calculator to finally produce our best guess at how observable these targets are going to be with Roman. And again, this is developed as an open source project, so both the data and the back end of the database, the code that generates all this, are available for anybody to look at that wants to. But essentially, the key point here is that the vast majority of our best targets are going to be indirectly detected exoplanets, are going to be planets that have only been detected via radio velocity, which means that we fundamentally do not know how bright or large these things are. And so we have to have a way of estimating the uncertainty of our ability to actually see them. And that is the primary intent of this database. And what you see in this final product is a two-dimensional histogram for a specific known planet. that basically shows that it can have up to 6 orders of magnitude variation in its brightness based on uncertainties and what we know and don't know. And it can also appear at a wide range of projected separations. The blue line is an overlay of nominal instrumental predicted performance. And of course, we have much better models for that now as well. So essentially, if anything in the histogram that's below this line is nominally observable by us, and anything that's above is not. And based on that, we can prioritize targets based on our probability of actually being able to see them. And a key aspect of our work is actually finding the best times to look, because this density function moves in time with the orbital motion of the planet, and that changes our probability, as shown on the right-hand side of this graph. Finally, Ilya is going to talk a lot about the instrument itself, so I'll skip through this, but we have a lot of possible masks and modes and ways of setting up the instrument. There's only really a handful of fully supported mode, again, owing to this being a technology demonstration. And so there's a bunch of hardware that's going to fly that has not been fully exercised on the ground. So this is also coupled with the fact that the actual high contrast dark hole digging is going to be done with ground in the loop. And this opens up the possibility of both potentially commissioning new modes on Sky and also bringing guest algorithms in the ground in the loop, otherwise known as the GITL. And so this has been a key area that the hardware working group has been working on, and they've been considering both the various open loop techniques for improving contrast and the potential for developing future closed loop techniques that would be guest high order wavefront sensing and control modes in the ground in the loop architecture. And so that has been a key area of work for the hardware working group. So what comes next? As Jeff told us, launch window opens with the delivery of the launch vehicle in October 2026. There's an incredible amount of work to be done up until then. There will be one more round of solicitations. If you are interested, please go look at the draft language. Please give your comments. And we are also planning for a CPP-specific splinter at the Winter AAS. So stay tuned for that announcement. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Dmitry. Let's give Dmitry a round of emoji clapping hands. Thank you again, Dmitry. Really appreciate it. And why don't we hold off questions until after Ilya's talk, unless Ilya has something really quick to ask. Nope. All right. Well, thank you again, Dmitry, for calling in. Really appreciate it. And again, we'll make sure to get out the word about all the various happenings at AAS having to deal with Roman. So stay tuned for those as well. Next up, we'll be switching to Ilya. Ilya, do you want to start screen sharing? All right. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
And yep. And whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Okay. And presumably you see the right screen. Okay.
Looks great.
Thanks, Rob, for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I'm Ilya Poberezhskiy. I am the Coronagraph Instrument Systems Engineer at JPL. In terms of overview, I will go fast. I think all of the people on this call are very familiar with the Roman Space Telescope, 2.4 meters, wide field instrument, and coronagraph tech demo. As was discussed, L2 orbit and the launch planned no earlier than October 2026. So coronagraph is here, while the wide field instrument is here. In terms of coronagraph, we have capability to perform high contrast broadband imaging, high contrast slit spectroscopy, and high contrast extended source imaging in polarimetry. And as you might have surmised from Dmitry's talk, high contrast broadband imaging is our requirement. It's our threshold requirement. We refer to it colloquially as TTR5. And in terms of spectroscopy and polarimetry, these are effectively our goals. We have the hardware on board. We have managed to do some calibrations of both spectroscopy and polarimetry during the TVAC campaign. And so if the time and resources allow, they can be commissioned and used on orbit. But the focus of the TVAC campaign that you will hear about was on meeting our requirement that related to imaging. Coronagraph is technology demonstration instrument, risk class D, and implemented by JPL in partnership with Goddard, industry, international partners, and academia. This slide is a overview of Coronagraph, very high level. So it's a large instrument, the size and weight of a grand piano, as one of our colleagues reminds us periodically. So it's a good analogy to imagine the size of CGI, about 303 kilograms in weight, and the power is less than 340 watts in operations. It is a room temperature bench instrument, which is convenient because the alignment in the room temperature is not expected to change in orbit. In terms of wavelengths, our primary band is centered around 575 nanometers and 10%, and we have other bands to the longer wavelength side of it. As you will see, our testing campaign, due to time constraints, really focused on this primary band we call band 1, but we have silicon cameras, so the wavelength extends up to about a micron. The field of view is about 7 arc seconds unvignetted, and it's much larger in the sensor limited sense. Point and jitter is a major potential performance constraint for CGI, so we control it internally using a fast steering mirror. After control, as you will see, the requirement is to have it under 1 milliarc second per axis, and we've met it with significant margin. Without control, it is on the order of 10 milliarc seconds. We also have optics in CGI that give us pupil imaging and phase retrieval capabilities. We use 2 cameras that are nominally identical, but are used in a very different way. They both use EMCCD sensors, electron multiplying CCDs with gain. For the science camera, we call XCam, we use the 1K by 1K pixel region. For the second camera, we use only a 50 by 50 pixel corner of the camera in order to allow very fast readout, essentially at 1 kilohertz. So this is done for wavefront sensing and control. The control bandwidth, though, is significantly lower. It's on the order of 20 hertz. Both cameras are kept cold with a nominal temperature of minus 88 C. One piece of hardware that really sets Coronagraph CGI apart from other space coronagraphs that were flown before is 2 high actuator count 48 by 48 deformable mirrors. And we use about 1,640 actuators on each of them. So we only individually activate the actuators on which the light falls. Anything in the corners or in the center where the shadow of the Raman secondary mirror falls is not actuated. We also have 6 XY precision alignment mechanisms delivered to us by our German colleagues from MPIA. Our data rate is comfortably within Raman capabilities. And just in terms of complexity, again, we have 49 electronic slices, 9 unique FPGA design, a computer card that's identical to the one used by the Whitefield instrument and Raman spacecraft. So it's delivered to us from Goddard. Some synergies there. It's a Leon 4 processor from plus RTG4 FPGA. And overall, it's 260,000 source lines of codes, which is pretty large amount for an instrument, about an order of magnitude more than typical. Dmitry talked about this chart in terms of capabilities, both requirements and CBEs, so I'll skip it. This is the test sequence of integration and test steps that I will describe very briefly and that cover the last 2 years. So once the components were thoroughly tested by the subsystems and delivered to the INT CGI integration and test, there was a period of optical bench alignment in parallel with electronics palette integration. Then Coronagraph for the first time became one instrument when the integration of the optical bench and the electronics palette were completed, followed by a full functional test. Then we performed environmental tests, starting with EMI, EMC, and then dynamics. We'll talk about that. And then the heart of the performance verification campaign was a thermal vacuum test, since this is a space-like environment from coronagraphy perspective. And finally, delivery and checkout at Goddard. So this slide just gives you a slight insight into the integration of the coronagraph. Here you just see the optical bench towards the end of the initial optics integration using interferometer. There we encountered an unexpected challenge because deformable mirror focus on astigmatism change as a function of humidity after electrical characterization. This was an effect that was understood, but not necessarily foreseen. And we have adjusted static optical alignment to reduce Z4 and Z6 with the deformable mirrors under purge. So this allowed us to have sufficiently low wavefront error that it is comfortably correctable by the deformable mirrors. The other part of coronagraph, you can see it's located right below the optical bench, is the electronics palette. So there are 6 electronics boxes, each with many slices, which sit on aluminum pallet with heat pipes embedded into it to take the electronic heats out to the radiator. And this coronagraph electronics was very unique. And there are 2 deformable mirror electronics assemblies, each driving 1 DM. They're actually the largest assemblies you can see, and novel as well. We ran relatively late into an issue that a batch of resistors we used turned out to be faulty, and we had to replace 14,392 resistors. That was an interesting adventure, and added quite a bit of schedule. But regardless, all of this was done, and the 2 parts of the coronagraph, the optical bench and the electronics assembly, came together in August of 2023, so just over a year ago. The first test they underwent was the full functional test. This was a test that was done in air, so not in a flight-like environment. But this was the first test when we fully tested the instrument, hardware and software, all together in the system level. So we had 2 key pieces of GSE, ground support equipment. So on top of the coronagraph, you can see there is another bench. This is a coronagraph verification stimulus, which simulates a star and the telescope. So it provides the same interface as we expect to see in orbit after integration with Roman. And not seen here, there is a spacecraft interface simulator, which is a rack that provides the power and data interfaces. So again, this was a huge step forward. First time testing it as a system with a flight hardware and flight software, as well as ground software. So we've performed CVS to CGI first light and alignment. That was very exciting. You can see some of the first images here. Pupil image, with a pupil image lens and direct image of a quote-unquote star. And we've executed a very complex alignment and calibration sequence, including phase retrieval, wavefront flattening with the DM. So you can see it gets a lot better. The wavefront error gets a lot smaller after it's done. Putting masks and stops in the optical beam train, aligning the pupil, aligning the bore side, and so on. So this was a very intense operation. We demonstrated line of sight sensing and control with a fast steering mirror. In terms of actually digging the dark hole, we didn't get far. We only spent less than a day on it. We demonstrated data flows, but no meaningful dark hole. During this test campaign, we found several hardware, software, and ground software issues related to emergent behaviors. This is what we expected, and this is why we test. So some of these issues we fixed right during FFT, both on the hardware and software side. Some were fixed subsequently. So overall, it was a successful campaign that took us through, ended just before Thanksgiving of last year. Okay, EMI EMC was the next step for us. So you can see here coronagraph in an anechoic chamber at JPL. So this is where we test both irradiated emissions and susceptibility and conducted emissions and susceptibility. So in terms of emission, the judge here is the requirements levied by the observatory. The rest of the observatory must find that Coronagraph does not create problems for the spacecraft and WFI. And it doesn't. So any small exceedances that we had were waived, and with a close collaboration with the Roman EMI EMC lead. You can notice here there is no optical stimulus. So how do we understand our susceptibility? We looked at a number of gauges, such as encoder readings, but truly the most sensitive gauge in this configuration is camera noise. This is something that we can measure even in the dark, and this tells us whether we are being susceptible in a negative way. And subsequently, we can see that electromagnetic self-compatibility, so making sure that our one box does not harm another by means of radiated emissions or susceptibility, was really verified in TVAC when we did have the dark hole and the full set of coronagraph behaviors. So that campaign was successful, took place in December of last year. Here you can see, and I'm trying to launch a movie, which, so this is the dynamics campaign. We performed both the random vibe and sine vibe for all three axes. And previously, prior to that, we did the model test to verify that our modes are where they expected to be, and do correlation between the modeled modes and what we measured using accelerometers. And the campaign was successful, even though it was very stressful. We went through each axis, again, sine and random vibe on each axis, and only at the end of the campaign, we measured the optical alignment before and after and found that the changes were acceptable. Acoustic was done by analysis only, and there will be further sine vibes that will take place at Roman as a part of the higher level of assembly. Okay, finally, the last test was a thermal vac test, TVAC test, but this is also our main performance test. So it has several objectives. It has objectives that have to do with the thermal verification and validation, in the sense of surviving the space-like environment, being cold, being in vacuum, and so on. But this is also the environment where we don't have air, we can cool the cameras, and we can actually do coronography the only time prior to launch, because we have the appropriate stimulus here at this level. So let's see. So we went through hot ops, cold ops, survival, thermal balance, all of this was successful. In terms of thermal stability during operations, we actually achieved excellent stability. You can see some of it in this table. The stability of the bench was better than 10 millikelvin. And the stability of the deformable mirror, which is the most sensitive part of the observatory from optical stability requirements perspective, was better than 1 millikelvin. So in TVAC, thermal stability was excellent. We also performed cold camera calibrations for various temperatures of both the sensor and proximity electronics. Again, using lessons learned from a full functional test, we performed alignment and calibration. This time it went a lot smoother, and we actually get a chance to perform starlight suppression, focus, dig in the dark hole, and testing of line of sight loop and other low-level wavefront control loops. We measured throughput of the planet. We ran some validation tests of in-orbit-like scenarios and spectroscopy and polarimetry calibrations. So I know we don't have much time. I will go through this very quickly. We ended up doing 2 dark holes with 2 different masks. This is a hybrid LEO mask with a 3 to 9 lambda over D inner and outer working angle. This is a shape pupil mask with 6 to 20 lambda over D inner and outer working angle. So all in all, that took about 30 shifts of team's work. Team has worked incredibly hard, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. And overall, our TVAC was 55 days long. So contrast that we achieved that you can see here, which is about 4 times 10 to the minus 8, 3 to 9, and 2 times 10 to the minus 8, 6 to 20, is not necessarily a hard physical limit. We stopped when we ran out of time. There were some issues that we uncovered that we think will improve performance. Basically, the performance that we measured in TVAC is not necessarily the hard limit for what we will experience in orbit. And here you can see some movies of convergence. Let's see, let me start it. This is for the hybrid LEO mask. And you can see here the iterations of wavefront control. For those in coronagraphy, you recognize this beta bumps. This is steps when we allow DM to be more aggressive in its wavefront control, which temporarily makes contrast worse, but eventually it helps to actually break through some blocking issues and do better. So this is a standard approach of how we do HOFAS with both masks. And you can see, especially with the second one, that when we had to stop, the contrast was still going down. There is a discussion about coherent and non-coherent parts of contrast that is extremely interesting, but we don't have time for it, unfortunately. And let me show you one more thing related to the results. As I mentioned, one key aspect of the coronagraph is to dig the dark hole as deeply as possible, but the other part is to stabilize the dark hole, to keep it stable. And this really means keeping the pointing of the star on the occulter stable from jitter and from drift using the fast steering mirror. So you can see here, this is the LOFAS camera readings before and after you locked the loop. So you can see these blobs are moving around and then suddenly they stopped. This is the design versus measured Z2 and Z3 rejection. So you can see that our requirement was exceeded by more than a factor of 2. For one of the modes, actually a factor of 3. So a line of sight testing went quite well. And then finally, we take all of these piecewise measurements, raw contrast, the performance of control loops, but then the requirements is written in a different language. It's in the language of flux ratio noise, which is a top-level performance metric. So the requirement says SNR of 5, measurement on 10 to the minus 7 flux ratio planet, and you've heard it from Dmitry. So when we divide it, we say the total noise propagated through this error budget has to be less than 2 times 10 to the minus 8. And when we propagate all of this test results from TVAC through the error budget, we meet this requirement with about 76% margin. And this talks about reference differential imaging. Again, this is Dmitry's discussion. And there is more information in JITIS published last year, both on coronagraph modeling, in this John Christ paper, and on coronagraph error budget by Bijan Nemati. So finally, coronagraph was delivered to Goddard in May. It was tested, and then the formal handoff to the Roman team took place on June 3rd. So this is a team. It was just an incredible team effort. So many people work extremely hard on making this happen. Couldn't be more grateful to them. So this is the conclusions. I think you heard most of this already. One thing I want to point to is that more detailed materials on CGI design and TVAC results were presented during CGI workshop at IPAG a few weeks ago. So there is a link and various presentations you can see there. And also the team is currently submitting some of their results to the JITIS special issue on Roman coronagraph. It will be submitted, this fall and then published presumably sometime next year. So I definitely refer you to those resources for a lot more information. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ilya, for that awesome talk and updates on CGI. If all of you can just give me some clapping hands emojis, that'd be awesome. And now we have time for a quick question. You can either raise your hand, I'll call on you to unmute yourself, or you can write your question in the chat and I will read it out loud. I think the main takeaway here is that the chronograph is performing awesomely and is currently at Goddard waiting to be integrated with the Roman instrument carrier. And then in about 2 years, we'll be hopefully launching the Roman Space Telescope. So very exciting times. We're definitely in the home stretch before launch. Any questions at all from anyone? All right, not seeing any questions in the chat. Ilya clearly answered all their questions already. So thanks, Ilya, again for that excellent talk. And thank you all for calling in today. We'll talk with you next month at the next Roman Community Forum. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank
and
you.
hope to see you all getting involved in Roman. Thank you again, Ilya. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one. Bye.